Well, Keith Mines is a graduate of Brigham Young University, earning a bachelor's degree in history, after which he attended Georgetown University, where he earned a master's in foreign service. He is currently the director of the Latin American program at the United States Institute of Peace. He joined USIP after a career at the State Department, where he most recently was director for the Andean and Venezuelan affairs. In 32 years of diplomatic and military service, he has worked on governance and institution building in Central America and Colombia, Middle East peace in Israel and the West Bank, post-conflict stabilization in Haiti, Iraq, and Afghanistan, global financial stability and the environment in Brazil, security sector reform in Hungary, famine relief and tribal reconciliation in Darfur and Somalia, and creating a culture of lawfulness as the first director of the Merida Initiative in Mexico City. So he has been in many places right throughout the world doing a lot of important work. So this is really exciting that he will share some of this with us. He's a frequent contributor to publications such as the Foreign Service Journal and Orbis, and he has written extensively on post-conflict stabilization, peace building, and negotiations and the roots of civil conflict. His book, right, you see the slide for it here, Why Nation Building Matters, Political Consolidation, Building Security Forces and Economic Development in Failed and Fragile States, was published by the University of Nebraska Press just last year. And so please join me in giving Keith Mines a warm welcome to the Kennedy Center and BYU.
Well, thanks. It's a privilege to be here. I want to thank Stan and the Kennedy Center for inviting me today to share some thoughts on this topic. It's not every day you publish a book and the president himself refutes your main premise a few months later, but here we are, and I'll defend the premise as best I can, despite the president's insistence that it's not a very good idea. So I often reflect back on my time at BYU, and there was times when I thought it was kind of a provincial, parochial place where we were a little narrow-minded. And as I reflected back through my career, there were certain times that were just seminal when something that I experienced here or learned here just came back with full force. And I thought about that as I was preparing this because there was a couple times that have really been decisive for me in my career. I studied history, and I took David Montgomery, the late David Montgomery's course on Asiatic Russia, and it was just a kind of I thought it'd be an interesting course. I had no intention that I'd ever live in the places that he lectured on, but like a lot of things, you kind of take these courses and you pocket it somewhere in your mind. And sure enough, 30 years later, I was the consul general in northern Afghanistan, and who were my main partners? The Uzbeks, the Tajiks, and the Turkmen that he had taught us about. And I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting that you again, things you never thought would have come up, in fact, do in your career. The other thing I remembered about him that I thought was, if not unique, it was certainly different, was his willingness to talk about career and personal stuff in the international environment that he had also been active in. And that was very helpful for me at the time I was trying to figure out what to do. I also remember, there's a couple other things I'll share. I remember I was a freshman. I'd just gotten here. I was a freshman, and I had a poli-sci 101 class, and the movie Death Wish, this is the original Death Wish with Charles Bronson, came out. And it's amazing. Charles Bronson was the highest paid actor in the world at that time. But anyway, this was Death Wish, the one where his wife and daughter get killed in an apartment in New York City. And I think it's been remade a couple times since. And we love this theme in America. It's the vigilante theme, right? So off Charles Bronson goes, he buys some guns, and he just goes out cleaning up New York City single-handedly. And in the movie, they get all these raving reviews from people that say, this is great, we're glad we have somebody that's finally bringing justice to the city. So the professor just lets us ramble. He says, we all think about this, and we all knew the plot. So for 40 minutes, we all rambled. And then in the last 5 minutes, he said, okay, here's what I think. And he went on, and he just basically said, you got to be kidding. Those of you that think this is okay. He said, in a nation like ours, when you lose the institutions, you lose it all. There is never a time for vigilantism. I remembered that. So sure enough, we were out for 16 years doing different things in the world. We came back in 2016 to find a country that had somehow decided, on both left and right, that it was kind of okay to just go around the institutions, to crush the institutions. The institutions were not their friends. If they didn't get the outcome they wanted, we'll go burn something down or we'll go storm the Capitol. It was really kind of interesting to me that all those years before that, here at BYU, that I had this professor that was really ahead of the game on that. And then the third example was Professor Sipe, Western Civ 1 or 2. I think I had him for both. So there was one, I don't remember what triggered it, but he was giving a lecture once and he said something about, our last 3 wars have been with Asians. He said, maybe there's something we don't understand about each other. That was all he said. He didn't elaborate on it, we didn't get into the discussion, but it stayed with me. And I thought about that as I got into the world, both on a mission and then later in the Army and then later as a diplomat and different jobs, that I just didn't want to be that guy that didn't understand what was going on in that country, that I wanted to be able to penetrate the essence of what was happening in that country so that the decisions we made, the decisions I made, the things that I was able to influence would be made from a position of understanding the country that I was working with or working on. So let me do a little bit of, here we go. Pivot just for a second and talk about the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I currently work. So I retired about 2 years ago from the State Department, and I'm now the director, as Stan said, of the Latin America program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So this is our great building. It's the same architect that did the Salt Lake City Library, Public Library, Moshe Safdie, just a crazy genius of these kinds of buildings. And it's got embedded all these different symbols of what USIP stands for. So USIP was founded with the vision of a number of congressmen and senators that had fought in World War II and were convinced that we spent way too much money on national defense and national security, not enough on peace building. So their idea, they had the proposition that peace is achievable in a lot more countries and places than it is being currently achieved or was then being currently achieved if we could apply certain principles, support certain groups in their efforts to build a more peaceful world. So we conduct a mix of operational programs, analysis, convenings with the idea to try to spread some of the concepts that will help us to have a more peaceful world. One example is in my program, we have, for example, a program for Venezuelan women negotiators and women peace builders. And the idea is that it's statistically proven that the inclusion of women in peace building always gives a better outcome. And the Venezuelans, for whatever reason, have been very male-centric in their negotiation efforts and, frankly, in their governing. So that's one of the programs that we have. We train women peace builders that then become negotiators. The current round of negotiations has the highest number of women ever, I think in part because we just keep telling both sides, you really got to fix this. So today's lecture plays on my book, Why Nation Building Matters, Political Consolidation, Building Security Forces and Economic Development in Failed and Fragile States. The title is a real mouthful. I had a really clever title, and the publisher said, to heck with that, we got to get every keyword in there so when anyone Googles any of these things in Amazon, they'll find it. The nation-building brand is a bit damaged right now. Again, as I said, no less than the president himself has repudiated it, not just once, but twice. I'm arguing that there's no alternative to it, and that some of the negative reaction to nation building comes from a misunderstanding of the concept or even a misdefinition. So what am I calling nation building? So I'm looking at the nation state as two political concepts that have to be blended together. So the nation is formed by the political compact that unites a people of a defined territory under a single identity. It's a little bit more emotional. It's the blood and belonging that Michael Ignatieff talks about. The state is more practical. That's what manages the institutions that the nation needs to function. Do I have running water, education, health, and those sorts of things? Somalia was effectively a nation. There was no question that they were the Somali people in the Somali nation, but they had absolutely no state institutions, so the whole nation state of Somalia collapsed. Yugoslavia, on the flip side, had strong state institutions. Each of the entities in the former Yugoslavia had good state institutions, but it didn't cohere as a nation because they didn't agree on remaining a nation, so they split up into 7 different nation states. So essentially, the art of nation building is binding the nation and the state into a coherent, functioning whole. Democracy is in there somewhere, but it's not the first issue. It's also interesting to think about it. Jill Lepore and other analysts have talked about the United States not being strictly a nation state in the European model, but rather a state nation. And her idea is that since the project cohered around a vision of institutions and a new way of governing, the state part of this, rather than people that came in with a shared language and identity and all this, it was really the state that they cohered around. So our institutions in that concept are even more important. I would say even there's a sanctity to our institutions that we really have to recognize, because that's really what makes us cohere. There's not something else that we somehow feel a part of. So I'm part of a small cabal of nation builders, believers in nation building, along with Jim Dobbins, Michael McLaughlin, Nadia Shadlow, Rufus Phillips, Ryan Crocker, our former ambassador to Afghanistan, and the Nobel laureate Roger Myerson. Again, my concept is quite simple, that nation building, and there's really nothing else to call it. I had a discussion once with a mentor about, can we just rebrand it? And he said, you can rebrand anything you want, but you're missing the point. That is essentially what it is and what's essential. So I propose that we've had more successes in this field than we let on, that it can work, but that often our impatience, our erratic mood swings, our lack of an architecture and doctrine stand in the way of doing nation building well. The book itself is part memoir, part lessons learned. There's some flyers back in the back that gives you a 40% discount. The price is still a little bit high, but with the discount, it comes down to an affordable place. And I just mentioned there would not have been a book without the support of my wife, Cecile, and my kids, Jonathan, Joshua, Rachel, and Daniel. And Joshua is graciously joining us here today. So I tell the story of 8 countries where, for a variety of reasons, the United States sought fundamental changes in the way these countries were governed, or in some cases felt strongly enough about just getting them to a point where they were governed at all. And I know it sounds glaringly ambitious, but also a bit arrogant to say that. What I would suggest is that when what those countries are facing is terrorism, genocide, famine, civil war, that perhaps it's not so ambitious or so arrogant after all, that those are fundamental things that in many cases are a critical U.S. interest. So the 8 cases of the Cold War era: interventions in Grenada and El Salvador, humanitarian interventions in Somalia, Haiti, and Darfur, the post 9/11 cases of Afghanistan and Iraq, and then Colombia, which is a long enough conflict that it spread across all 3 periods. And then I've had some touches with Panama and the Balkans as well. So embedded in the cases are the stories of the soldiers, diplomats, contractors, humanitarian officials, UN officials, others who served, and the governors, police chiefs, civil society leaders, business persons, and youth that they served with. However any of these cases turned out, it was not, in my view, for lack of trying by us or many of our partners. In nation building, I would posit that there is never failure, only incomplete success. So if you allow me, I'll walk briefly through these 6 popular myths of nation building, which reflect throughout the book. Oops, here we go. There we go. So the easiest way to dismiss nation building is to affirm that it just doesn't matter, that it has no place in our foreign policy priorities. But consider a few of the issues and examples from recent history. There we go. Whoop. No, I skipped one. There we go. All right. So this one's always my favorite. In 2004, Thailand, in the midst of one of the avian flus, was required to kill 40 million chickens to get a hold of the pandemic. It could have killed thousands of people. How do you kill 40 million chickens without a nation state, without a functional nation state, without some institutions, some ability to spread information and pay people off for the chickens they had to kill, all that sort of thing? It was something only a functioning nation state could have done. The COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, is another one that is just a baseline issue, is the functionality of the nation states that are dealing with it. Second is migration. Currently, 65 million migrants worldwide. Migrants fleeing their homes in Central America and Haiti because of their nations are too weak to provide economic opportunity, and curtail violence is a critical issue for us right now. And third, terrorism, the issue that caused the most dramatic shift from anti-nation building to uber-nation building under the Bush administration before we finally have talked ourselves out of it again. But I would argue that a state's ability to control what happens on its territory is really the only way in the long term to control terrorism. And I use the example in another piece I just wrote of the sheriff model versus the mayor model. So the sheriff model is every time there's an attack, we'll go out, we'll round up a posse, send the sheriff out there to get the bad guys, and then come home. The mayor model is more going to that small western town that's got these cattle rustlers or terrorists, whatever they are, and have the mayor empowered to build the institutions, the economics, the things that will make that region viable, sustainable, and will preclude the operating space for those terrorists to begin with. To me, it's difficult to see how the United States can stay ahead of key challenges absent a world of strong and capable states that can control their territory and apply local solutions to global problems. Claire Lockhart and Michael McLaughlin put it this way: if the 20th century was consumed by the global struggle between incompatible ideologies, fascism, communism, and democratic capitalism, the 21st century will be consumed by the epic challenges of creating and sustaining viable states. So the quality of the nation state, I would argue, remains the first pillar in American prosperity and global security. So myth number 2, nation building never works. There we go. Look, so citizens must build their own nations. We cannot do it for them, we, the international community. But the international community can be helpful, even decisive in the endeavor, generally from a respectful distance. And the track record of the international community in this is not as bad as we sometimes have led ourselves to believe. Ambassador Jim Dobbins, with whom I worked closely on 4 of these, was then when he was special envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan in 2002, talked about a meeting in the NSC where he said that the National Security Council staff circulated a paper arguing that peacekeeping was a failed concept, one that was proven not to work. He comments that the assertion was stunningly ill-informed, conceding that whether the concept would work in Afghanistan was an open question. But the preceding decade had seen successful peacekeeping operations in Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, East Timor, Mozambique, Liberia, El Salvador, Namibia, Cambodia, Albania, and Macedonia. Tens of millions of people were living at peace and for the most part under freely elected governments because UN, NATO, American, or European troops had come in, separated combatants, disarmed contending factions, rebuilt the country, held elections, installed new governments, and stayed around long enough to watch them take root. The Balkans, I think, is one of the clearest examples of this. From a war that killed hundreds of thousands when the former Yugoslavia broke up, following the end of the Cold War, to the Dayton Accords, when a very assertive and patient application of international force and some very skillful diplomacy, the countries of the Balkans were able to get a fresh start and build anew. It's not paradise. They're still unequally challenged by crime, corruption, weak governance, and all the rest. But it's not Srebrenica, and it would not have happened without outside assistance. So nation building, to me, can work, and there's times when outside assistance is the essential component in the search for peace and stability. So myth 3, nation building always involves armed intervention. One of the things in recovering the damaged brand of nation building should probably start with making clear that is not synonymous with invading and governing foreign countries. There are times when military intervention is the only way to excise a menacing dictator or control a threat. And the political dynamic in some countries is so badly damaged that the only armed outsiders can restore a peaceful resolution to political conflict. But some of the most successful cases have been done without direct intervention, others with near bloodless interventions. Among the most successful cases over the past decades, Colombia stands out. I touched Colombia 4 times, first as an LDS missionary in the late 70s, then as an intelligence analyst in the late 80s, then as director of Andean Affairs in 2017, and now in USIP we've got a team in Colombia working on post-conflict peace building in post-FARC areas. So through a decade of Plan Colombia, in which the United States provided robust military, development, and technical assistance that was matched by the country's own large commitment of resources and manpower, Colombia was able to build new institutions, restructure its economy, and defeat a daunting array of violent non-state actors. This assistance allowed the Colombian state the breathing room to then go on to conduct an internationally facilitated agreement, negotiation that led to an historic agreement between the government and the FARC in 2016. Colombia still struggles. The ELN, the other guerrilla group, has not agreed to reconciliation. Violence persists. The recent demonstrations evince a lack of trust by youth in their government. Human rights violations are still high. But as nation-building projects go, Colombia is nothing short of inspiring, ending a 50-year civil war and leading to the country's current tourism pitch, which is that the biggest danger in Colombia today is that you won't want to leave. Ambassador Bill Brownfield said it was the most successful nation-building project that the United States has associated itself with in the last 25 to 30 years. And it was done without a single battle casualty from the outsiders. El Salvador, I would argue, is a similar case in a very similar situation. So getting the formula right about when to intervene, how long to stay, when to take a more indirect approach is the art of nation building. It's not a science, but certainly would be better served by real artists than by house painters. So number 4, we cannot impose our system on others. This one's a little tricky. Tricky to get there, too. There we go. What I would argue is that the national project of the United States is far more generic than we often give ourselves credit for. Formed as it was by practical individuals who needed to blend a disparity of religions and cultures and economic realities into a single nation. It yielded a country where, at least on paper, national identity rises above destructive class or religious or ethnic exclusion, and the shared national identity revolves around core values of individual rights, dignity, and opportunity for each citizen under an umbrella of good governance marked by inclusion and transparency. If the implication is that these things are culturally heavy-handed, we should consider the alternative, which is generally what drew the international community in the first place. The issue of which model is right for a country played out in both Afghanistan and Iraq with a great deal of local complexity. And I've got tons of thoughts on this. We can do more in the Q&A, but I'll just give you a few vignettes and a few ideas on this up front. And I'm not saying it's a simple issue. There was tons of mistakes made along the way where we violated this principle ourselves. But I remember one session of the Loya Jirga, the Grand Council that the Afghans have known and used for centuries to make collective decisions. This is just how they do things. This is their Philadelphia. So following the liberation of Afghanistan from the Taliban in December 2001, the international community facilitated this very Afghan gathering, something that the broken Afghan nation would not have been able to do on its own. And I was one of a handful of foreigners that were inside the tent watching the deliberations take place. So at one point, a female delegate was they had these open mic days where they just had two microphones set up and people would just pile in. Of the 1,700 delegates, 250 which were women, and they would just pile up behind the mics and just rant and rave and talk about their vision for the country. So it was a bit of a national dialogue combined with a decision-making body. And so an Afghan woman goes up to the mic, and I'm getting this through my interpreter. So he says that she said, "Look, I don't want my daughter to have to wear a burqa, but I don't want her to look like Britney Spears either." Britney Spears. Get this right, Britney Spears. So I was surprised she knew who Britney Spears was. And I looked at my interpreter. I said, "Are you taking a little license with this?" And he said, "Well, I just want to make sure you understood what she's saying." Okay. So I got the idea. So what she didn't want was the quote-unquote local model. So if people are arguing, well, there's a local model here, we don't want to impose on it. That was not what she wanted, because the local model in 2000 consisted of violent competition between warlords and Islamist extremists that had pushed a third of the country out of the country as refugees. She wanted something new, and a facilitated approach to arriving at that something new, I would argue, was not culturally heavy-handed. And if you say, well, that's not what they want, you also have to be careful about who the they are. there may be a they that wants power and doesn't want us around because it takes away from their power. That doesn't mean that's the entire country or its citizenry. In Iraq, there was a similar situation, a similar kind of urge for something new. When I was recently arrived in 2003 in Al-Anbar as the governance coordinator for this big province, and a Sunni, very fractious, punchy province that we knew was going to be problematic. It turned out to be the heart of the insurgency. But I asked my interpreter, I'm trying to get a lay of the land for the tribal panorama. So I said, so of all these guys, who is your sheikh? And he looked at me, and with as much passion as he could muster in a language not his own, he said, Mr. Keith, I am my own sheikh. That was where he was. I would say that was where a lot of Iraq was, and to the extent that there was something considered culturally heavy-handed, often it was actually engaging those that wanted change against those that didn't. In the 2 decades preceding the arrival of the coalition forces in 2003, Iraq had been in the docket of the Security Council every session. It had one of the world's most reckless and advanced programs for weapons of mass destruction, gassed its own people, brutally attacked 2 neighbors, and drained the wetlands where the marsh Arabs had lived for centuries. The long work of consolidating democratic governance in a country of 3 historically contentious nationalities, a kleptocratic command economy where order was reinforced by state-sponsored violence, was always going to take time to get right. But the local model was not something to be nostalgic about. There's one major caveat to all this, which is how the recipient country and people receive and internalize outside involvement. And this is something that we've often got wrong, but we've at times gotten right. And Tony Lake and Rufus Phillips have written and spoken about this. And if you're not familiar with Rufus Phillips' book, Why Vietnam Matters, a really excellent account of his time going all the way back to Lansdale. There's a new book by Max Boot about Lansdale and his mission in Vietnam, but it's probably one of the best books about what could have been in Vietnam, what went wrong. But Rufus Phillips lives in the D.C. area. He's just a phenomenal guy. He's got really some great ideas about this. But he said this about Vietnam. He said, we underestimated the motivating power of Vietnamese nationalism. We failed to comprehend the fanatical determination of an enemy willing to sacrifice its entire people until only the Politburo was left. We thought in conventional World War II battlefield terms when the conflict was at its heart a political one, a war of ideas and of the spirit. So there's, between this desire for change by many people in many countries and us overreaching and sparking the very nationalism which will quell that, there's a dance. It's not an easy one. I'm not saying it is, but it's something that I think we have to figure out how to get in the middle of that in a way that's effective. So number 5, nation building can be done quickly. This is my favorite. Probably the most important. There's a constant question of which comes first. I posit that there's these 3 pillars of security, economics, and politics, which goes with development, defense, and diplomacy. So it kind of fits the standard triad of things the tools that we have to work on foreign policy abroad, and also, again, the things that are going on internally. But there's a constant question about which comes first in these pillars: security, the economy, political consolidation. I wrote a dissent channel message in the State Department in the spring of 2003, where I didn't say we shouldn't go to Iraq because I didn't have all the information. I would leave that to the people that did. But I did say that there was no way we could achieve long-term stability in Iraq without a focus on the political agreement that would help define the country or redefine the country, and that was going to be a lengthy and difficult process. It was just going to take a long time. There was no way to buy our way out of it. There was no way to fight our way out of it. It was just going to take time. As the late Lawrence Pizzulo put it, we're a developed nation that is accustomed to quick answers in almost every other area. But when you throw yourselves into a revolution, there are no quick answers. In part, this has to do with the simple context of what we're dealing with, which is not a small cuts and bruises clinic, but rather the emergency room. And it's usually the emergency room for patients that have been serially abused. The societies in question are going to go in multiple transitions, any one of which would be brutally difficult if done in isolation. From command economies to globalized free markets, from narrow dictatorships to inclusive democracies, from tribally organized to civil societies, from isolation to global connectivity, from secular regimes to newly discovered religiosity, all against a demographic picture that would make Malthus cringe. None of these societies will have the luxury of managing these transitions in an orderly way. History and geography have thrown everything at them at once, and there's many processes that simply can't be rushed. So Haiti, where I worked on post-conflict stabilization in Haiti from 1995 to 97, probably the extreme example of this. Difficult country historically, culturally, politically. Like Central America, it suffered from isolation, broad-based lack of development, and a predatory ruling class. Our efforts to help build a functional state amidst the wreckage of the Duvalier dictatorship were honest, reasonably well managed, but no effort could compensate for a political process that just never cohered. And that was the piece that the outsiders had the least control over. So there were simply no shortcuts. The Haitian people needed to learn through several decades, needed to learn democratic principles to finally disgorge from the country their beloved but very destructive leader, ended up a dictator, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And the lesson for the outsiders was pacing with enough inputs to the economy to avert collapse, enough improvements to governance and security to keep the country on a modestly improving trajectory until the overall picture improved, which we actually thought it was until just a few weeks ago. The pullout of the UN in 2018 at the U.S. behest was actually a very critical moment when we had pulled out the support that was kind of keeping the country together. Somalia, a similar case, it would require decades of attention, not the months that were initially budgeted. I served briefly in the UN mission there after the Black Hawk Down incident, and one could see that the consolidation of any kind of political order was going to be a very long and tedious process. But I worked for a very skilled UN Special Representative, Lansanas Kouyaté, there on the left, went on to be Guinea's prime minister. He was just a phenomenal diplomat, and I found a couple things there. One is that the UN often has a better array of talent than the U.S. We should never assume that we have the best people. The UN can do this stuff for a longer period of time, and they can often do it more effectively than a U.S.-led coalition. But he was a really phenomenal guy. He got them at that time to a place through a lot of negotiations and ups and downs to where he at least bought a couple of years of stability. They got a couple of crops in, the famine subsided, there was a political reconciliation between Ali Mahdi and his 10 tribes or his 10 clans, and Aidid and his 2, and they got to a point where at least it was somewhat stable. There was a lot more ups and downs to come, and it has not been a smooth path, but it is once again a country. So through the course of these last 25 years, it has actually re-entered the family of nations. Myth 6, I'll go through really quick, and this is that we have the right architecture to do nation building, and if we don't do it well, it must have been their fault. We like to blame it on the other guys, right? In the book, I share 10 principles, the first of which is that the process of stabilizing and bringing back to health failed and fragile nations. The first thing, again, is to get the political compact right. I've got a lot of different examples in the book that talk about how to do that. Heather Selma Gregg said that building or rebuilding a state requires more than developing the capacity of its government or security forces. State building programs also need to foster and strengthen the population's sense of common identity and the need for its various factions to work together to build a healthy, prosperous state. In other words, a state needs a population that coheres and supports the government and other state-building institutions for it to flourish. This is national unity building. When we hear about the critiques of nation building, we often hear, why should we be spending that money abroad? Let's bring that money home. People, I think, usually what they're thinking about, they're saying, let's bring that money home to build our physical infrastructure. What I'm arguing here is that the physical infrastructure, and this is true in our country as well, that's the easy part. You just find the money and build stuff. The hard part is this national vision and cohesion as a country, as a political entity. And that's the hard part. It's hard abroad. It's seemingly getting harder here as well. So let me close with just a tribute and some examples of some of the people that I worked with. This is also, again, there's lots of stories in the book about kind of the unsung heroes. So this is just one example. This was one of our military advisors that was out in Darfur. The mission in Darfur was very unique. It wasn't a military intervention at all. It was all done diplomatically with sanctions and diplomatic pressure on the Sudanese government to stop going out and slaughtering the people in Darfur. When they agreed to do that and they held back the forces that were doing that, it was then time for an African Union at the time peacekeeping mission to go in, and then later a UN mission to blend with that African Union mission. We sent about 20 advisors out. They were not even in the military. They were retired military. We sent them out on contract, and they were sent to places. I don't even know how they got there sometimes. I'd look at the place on a map, and I couldn't even figure out how they got there. But they were just these brave, courageous, retired military guys that were willing to go out and do this work, frankly, for not a lot of money, I recall. And they were the ones that kind of held together these pieces of the peacekeeping mission, where they provided intelligence support and different mentoring of the African Union forces that made them effective. We had the guy on the left is Steve Burke, the left, my agricultural advisor in Afghanistan. Again, unsung heroes. The Afghan wheat harvest between 2002 and 2012 increased from 2,000, I screw these figures up, 2,000 million metric tons to 3,000 million metric tons. It increased by about 50%. The reason was because our ag advisors went around the country putting in a new kind of wheat seed that just led to a more resilient kind of wheat. So again, that's culturally insensitive. They ended up eating better as a process, as a result. The guy on the right-hand side there, next to me, on my left, is one of our border task force guys. So we had guys also out that were retired border agents that helped to work out a new border arrangement in Afghanistan. Civil affairs was very active in the Army. It turned out that the mainstream military did not come with the skills that were needed to do a lot of this, so we had just phenomenal civil affairs guys. The guy in the suit, Steve Bittner, a BYU graduate, was serving in Poland, just wanted to help out, so he came down and joined my team in Iraq. I was always a little concerned about sending these guys out with AK-47s every day who probably knew not how to use them, but really phenomenal guy, great Arabic skills, and really did some great work on the early Iraqi elections. And then our Afghan partners were phenomenal. Our Afghans and Iraqi, these are all Iraqi examples, but women again started to step forward to see what their new place would be in society, very anxious to be involved. Guy in the middle, Sheikh Khaled Suleiman, after the 9/11 attacks, wrote a very stirring essay called Toward a World Without Terror. He worked tirelessly for peace in different parts of Iraq until he was killed. And the guy, small picture in the top, is Governor Barges, also a very courageous guy that I work closely with. The guy below him is one of the new party leaders as Iraq was starting to open up its political system. I know we're frustrated with how things turned out. I get that. But when we lose interest or we get frustrated, it doesn't mean 30 million Iraqis just went away. It means they continue to struggle without us, which is fine. But they are still in this fight between two models of how to live, whether under a dictatorship, a kleptocracy, and all this other stuff, or something more like our more open system. And I would say in today's world, with the clash of tribes and everything else, there really is no model but a generic one that allows for inclusion, closes out kleptocracy and corruption, certainly has a way forward out of violent conflict. And that's what we've been trying to do. However erratically we've done it, and however poorly we've done it at different times. So the book has also this question of doctrine and what we need to do to get it all right. It's been an adventure. I wouldn't want to do it again. There's a flyer on the back if you want to order the book. Again, it's got the discount code, and here it is again. But you have to order from the University of Nebraska. That's not through Amazon. So anyway, I'd be happy to take questions, or if you have comments or critiques, I'd be happy to listen to those as well.
We'll ask you for your questions again to please come to the microphone here. Tell Mr. Mines, right, your name and what you're studying so he gets to know you a little bit. And we'll continue. We know some of you, as we get closer to 1 o'clock, may need to leave. If you do, please just do so as quietly as you can, but we'll go for at least until 1 o'clock. So please.
And I'm happy to stay after if you have career questions, because there may be individual things I'd be happy to stay and answer.
Hi, I'm Laura Bailey. I'm a communication disorders major, and my question is just, what do you think United States citizens can do to support nation building abroad?
Good question. I think the debate is often very shallow. I think so. I think being informed, it would be probably the first thing. Being able to convey different thoughts locally, certainly writing, local papers, local publications would be good. I mean, I used an example in another forum. I remember some years ago when there was a town in Utah that declared itself a UN-free town, and that visceral reaction, against the UN and against this sort of thing, it's gotten really unhealthy. It's very unhealthy, and I think people are misreading a lot of this. It's bipartisan now, which is it used to be one side that you could kind of rely on, but it's not anymore. It's really, so I think being informed would be the place to start.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Caleb Harding. I'm at computer science and studying computer science and Chinese here. So currently China has their own, flavor of nation building with their Belt and Road Initiative, which focuses more on building stuff. But I was wondering if you could comment on, that, whether or not you think that will be effective, or if the U.S. should kind of mimic that.
That's a great question. That's actually the big thing now in Washington, is what they call strategic competition. I would just say that the United States is trying to compete on the cheap, and the Chinese are competing with money. And I think we're getting kind of our clock cleaned in a lot of places because we don't come in with resources. The Chinese model is not a great one. It's very corrupt and corrupting, but they're coming in to build stuff. And I think that's one thing that we would need to do if we were to compete. I don't think it's going to end. I think they've got the resources to continue this for a very long time. We traveled in Zambia on a vacation a few years ago, and there was just Chinese construction everywhere. My region in Central America and South America is the same thing. They're just there with money in a way that the United States is not. So I think they've kind of got the right idea, because there's the nations are so cash strapped that they'll go for that. The problem is that their way of dispersing money is so corrupting, and it's just so narrowly focused in terms of who benefits from it, and they're still, I think, just awkward abroad. I will just say it. I think that Chinese diplomacy and all these things are very transactional. They're very narrowly focused on them getting something out of it for what they're giving to the countries. So I don't think it's long-term and sustainable. I think the American model over time is much better, because we come in with a private sector and with a lot of different things that are beneficial to a country over the long term. We also establish a long-term relationship, certainly with Latin America. It's a very easy relationship. 20% of Americans speak Spanish. So I think to get aced out by the Chinese is kind of embarrassing, frankly.
Well,
Thanks.
My name is Mark Wisnet, and I'm undeclared. And my question is, what is the dialogue between world leaders when a country chooses to rebuild or restructure a nation? And is there a consensus that this nation needs help?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the UN is where a lot of this takes place and should take place. The G7, G8, I forget where we are right now. Also a place where there's usually kind of a nod to, and the new way this is usually referred to as state fragility, to try to strengthen states that are fragile. So there's different places and different venues where this stuff could take place. The OAS is not too much in this business right now in the hemisphere, but I think it's usually on the docket of these different global meetings, the OSCE or the UN. NATO has a certain interest in this. So I think there's places where being around these. Again, I think there needs to be somebody that puts forward a new approach to kind of, if not brand, at least, reset the debate to where there's a willingness to put resources and things behind it. There's just an exhaustion with a lot of this right now that I think is a little bit dangerous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Julia. My major is international relations. And I was wondering what you think has been or will be the most successful route for nation building that's nonviolence?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I feel strongly about a lot of what we do at USIP, trying to build, national consensus, end polarization, and find ways to dialogue. Actually, the country that I work on right now is Venezuela. So talk about a country that's crying for nation building. I mean, 6 million refugees, have left the country, a stunning amount for a country that was so wealthy, and it's all of its infrastructure has collapsed, oil sector, everything else. So really, a country that is crying for these things. There's no military solution to that. We threatened in the last administration, thumping chests, we threatened to invade. They knew that wasn't going to happen. We were uninvading countries, not invading countries. So that was a kind of a false threat that actually did more harm than good because it cohered the military on the Venezuelan side, on the Chavista side. So I would say that the only route for them is a negotiated coexistence. And that's something we work on a lot at USIP. It's so, for a nation like that needs to cohere nationally, then needs to have a way to rebuild its infrastructure, have a political system that works, there's got to be a negotiated way forward. And that I would say that would be the one thing, when it's not at a threat level that somebody has to militarily intervene, I would say that negotiation is the place where the emphasis needs to be. And there's a lot that can be done there that hasn't been done. So,
Thanks.
thank you.
Hello, my name is Harun Cowley.
Hi.
I'm studying international relations. You mentioned that things in Afghanistan could have gone a bit better, and it's been often noted that it wasn't generally expected that the government would fall so quickly. So I was just wondering, according to these principles that you outlined, what are some things that you felt could have gone better in Afghanistan that we could have done or they could have done?
I guess that I would suggest that one of that we often flip the political and the military in where they should have been. I mean, I think I was there in 2002 and then again in 12 and 13. So I had a 10-year absence and came back. And what I saw was that it was always about that political cohesion at the national level. It was super difficult to achieve that because there was a number of reasons. They had a problem with the periphery and the center, so they didn't have a federalist system. It was a centralized system that appointed governors and things, but it kind of often left the provinces a little bit on their own. So there was a lot of things in the political system that were always going to be difficult, but it was their political system. It was their constitution. Nobody tried to rewrite the constitution or anything. So it was working within that system, and it was always just going to take a very long time. My own view is that we quit. I mean, I did not think it was the best idea to just leave like that. I think that it was actually sustainable, recognizing that it was going to take another couple of decades to probably get right. Now, is that worth the cost? I guess we'll find out if we see, what happens now. But there's a lot of mistakes made along the way. I would say, despite those mistakes, you still had a friendly government that kind of functioned. And then the collapse itself was tricky because what we see now is that there was so many of these military units on the Afghan forces that started to realize that once the support was withdrawn, it was a foregone conclusion they could not win. They're kind of not like us, where they don't have an Alamo approach to things, where that's not part of their mystique. Good American will just, stay here and fight until we die. That was not the way they functioned. They looked at it and said, if this is going this way, I think I better get on that side right now. And unfortunately, because they might have been able to hold out, but that was the signal for them that we need to be looking at switching sides, or at least allowing this thing to play out where we don't all get killed in the process. So, that was, again, it was a fairly abrupt withdrawal of critical support. And with that critical support, I think they probably would have been okay.
May I follow up on that real
Sure.
fast? So with all that, what do you think is going to happen now in their government or in relation to their international relations in the future?
So, the Taliban is, it is a different Taliban than it was in 2002. They've learned a lot. They've been living abroad. I think they're going to try to do at least a bare minimum to survive internationally. But it's really going to be tricky because they need a lot of support to survive at all. Just to get through the winter, there's going to need to be a lot of support. And it's going to be hard because the international community is not going to want to reward the Taliban. There's going to be this dance. Well, I hope it doesn't go the direction of Venezuela, where we have sanctions that are now increasing the suffering of the Venezuelan people in an already bad situation, not of our making, but certainly we're not making it better. So it's going to be very tricky for the international community to do that, but I think there'll be some kind of a transactional arrangement where if you do this, you'll get this assistance. And okay.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'm Belle. I'm
Right.
a poli-sci major, and I just had a question about, because I've heard different arguments. This is the first argument I heard on why nation building actually is important and why it's effective. But how would you respond to the argument of, like, I've heard that nation building from other scholars was only effective with the Marshall Plan after World War II. So how would you respond to that? And, like, I guess what constitutes a success for you?
Yeah, I mean, the Marshall Plan and Japan and Germany were special cases because they had been completely conquered and occupied. We weren't about to unoccupy them. We were going to stay there. And then the alternative for them was communism. Like, they knew that if they kicked us out, we withdrew, whatever, they would end up in the Soviet camp, or they were afraid they would end up in the Soviet camp. Germany certainly would have. So they were different in that sense. The one that I think is more clever is, as an example, is Korea, South Korea, which was also facing the specter of communism, so they were going to stay with the project. But we stayed with them for a very long time to get them to a place of stability. So I think Korea is the one that people often, forget about, and that was just a long, patient exercise of security assistance, a lot of economic assistance, building up from frankly a start that was about like Afghanistan was in 2002, a really destroyed country, and went through a really fraught political process through the 70s. I remember they were executing generals and stuff in the 70s, and it was a really long process to get to a democracy. But the other ones that Jim Dobbins mentions are also noteworthy. I mean, these are a lot of minor cases. Now, you have to have very low standards in this business, which I do, fortunately. So we're not trying to get these guys to a position of being Switzerland, just to stop fighting, stop the massacres, stop the famines, marginally functional, quasi-democracy, even with some corruption. And that's kind of, good enough. And that's something they can build from and develop. And but, a lot of real success stories in that, with those standards and in that realm. The Balkans, again, probably the best example.
Yeah. Sorry, I have a follow-up question on that. So then, in your opinion, when is enough enough? Because I understand, like,
Yeah.
nation building, it's a wonderful idea initially to go and start something, but then how long, like, if we're spending years and years, decades, and trying to pursue
Right.
these goals, when is enough?
I mean, what I would say is that two things. So one, there's some countries that are so important that we can't not do it. South Korea, again, great example. It was too important to us strategically. We were not going to leave it. There's others that are one rung down where I would say they're important enough but not critical. So we could gauge our level of support at a different level. We're not going to do everything, but we're going to do something. And sometimes something is enough. Haiti's a great example where it was a kind of sustainable mission in 2018 when we cut funding to all peacekeeping operations, and that caused the mission to close. That's where now, in my opinion, the mayhem has ensued because it was playing a critical role, mentoring the police, helping with the judicial system, and with a strong special representative there to help with the political process. And I would say that, a UN mission where we provide 25% of the funding, none of the troops, none of the police advisors when it was over, I think that's sustainable for a very long time. Now, again, that depends on how critical it is to us. Haiti is not a vital interest, but certainly seeing, 15,000 Haitians living under a bridge in Texas, that's kind of enough that we have to do something, right? And there is often a humanitarian imperative that we might not send troops in to die for, but we certainly ought to send money, diplomatic engagement, and some other things, right?
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Hi, I'm Ellie, studying international relations and especially interested in diplomacy in developing countries. And in my studies, I've recognized that the UN is good at fighting kleptocracy by providing foreign aid with like strings attached and requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you give me other specific examples of how working with the UN and through the UN is more effective in nation building than independently as the United States?
Yeah, so I mean, Somalia was going to be imposed as representative because we were going to have troops there that was far less effective than the one that the UN eventually sent, Lanzanas Kuyate. He was actually the deputy, and then he became the special representative. So they come, there's a whole cadre of people that do peace building in the UN, and they will stay for years in places that Americans, frankly, would be looking for an R&R in about a month. So they'll just stay there. They have their own lives that they've built up around this business, and they do it well. So I would say that's one thing. On the corruption side, some interesting things in the hemisphere. If you look at the two organizations, CICIG was one in Guatemala. There was another one in Honduras. But those were international. I think one of them might even have been independent. But they were not U.S. directed. It was more of an international effort to try to control corruption in these countries that were just hemorrhaging from corruption. And frankly, that was leading to a lot of the exodus of their citizens. So there's these creative international bodies that have been organized to help with things like corruption. A number of models, again, in Central America with that. And then the UN, not always the right. In the Balkans, it was not really the UN managing the mission. It was a NATO European mission with a strong U.S. component. So there's sometimes where you just need a more direct NATO operation. Afghanistan, of course, NATO was also there managing the military part of it, but the UN was doing a lot of the political. So if you get everybody kind of interested and involved, there's a way to package these things, I think, to where you can have a good division of labor that gets all the right things on the ground at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know our time is up. My name is Angela Amani. I'm an international relations major with a focus in Latin America. I've been concerned about Cuba for a long time just because I had a Spanish teacher for 8 years that was Cuban. What does U.S. involvement in Cuba look like right now? And is there any hope of them becoming a democracy within the next decade or even 2 decades?
Yeah, so I mean, there was the big push by the Obama administration to normalize relations. And the sense now, I guess, is that it didn't work. And so it's not time to give anything to the Cubans. It's not time to open up again. Jeff Flake still believes it is. I think he's got some good ideas on this, but nobody else does. So I think it's hard. Now, one of the things that gets interesting, of course, is our own domestic politics. So Florida politics being what it is, it's hard even for a Democratic administration at this point in time to do something something new on Cuba. So the easiest thing to do is continue with the status quo. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Nobody can blame you for that. If you try something new and it doesn't work, then you're in trouble, right? So I think it's going to be a long process of sort of waiting for change internally in Cuba. I mean, their situation is changing too. They're up against a lot of popular discontent. Who knows where that might play out, where they might be looking for something different themselves. Europe could probably play, a different role, I guess. There's some engagement from Spain and others that maybe could be. So I wouldn't, abandon hope. I think it's something that could change. Obviously, changes in leaders always happen, but there's nothing immediate, I'm afraid, that I can see.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Please join me one more time.